Welcome back everyone to another Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing setup. Today's video will focus on the midget cars at Arrowwood. So I've done several setup videos around the 410s at different types of tracks. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and focus on the midgets for at least a few different types of tracks to give you guys an idea of how I approach the setups in the midget cars. So Arrowwood is a place 4/10 of a mile with quite a bit of banking, and you can easily run this track wide open. So what we're going to focus on in today's setup is all about having the car minimize the amount of speed that you lose in the corners and therefore maintain a high average speed around the entirety of the track. There are a few different things that we can talk about and a few different ways of accomplishing that, so let's get to it. As we move through the setup for the midget cars here at Arrowwood, you'll notice a lot of similarities to what we talked about in the setup video for the 410s at Arrowwood. So it's a good idea to look at these setups side by side, and that will show you some very distinct differences as well as a lot of similarities in the setup, which should give you some ideas on how you can tighten or loosen the car just by comparing the two setups side by side. We'll begin our setup discussion with the shock values. And once again, I'm using at or very close to the minimums across the board. The reason for that are the bumps on this track. Now, in general, in the midget cars, I haven't found the bumps to be a huge issue, but by using the lower numbers around 3, 4, or even 5, then I find that the bumps become no issue whatsoever. However, if I go up to around 7, 8, or even 9, that the bumps can play a role. One great example of this is on the exit of turn 2. I find that if I hit some of the bumps just wrong with aggressive shock values, again, somewhere around 7, 8, or even 9, then it could cause the car to get very tight and jump out closer to the wall on corner exit, which of course causes us to scrub off more speed, which is not what we want. So the safer play for me at this track is just to use softer shock values here. Gives the car a little bit more play, a little bit softer feel, and slower reactions, which helps us to absorb those bumps a little bit better. Now moving to the weight settings, maximum left side weight and also maximum front weight and maximum cross weight. Now the reason we're doing this is, of course, we want maximum left side weight because we're on an oval. Really the only reason I can see for not using maximum left side weight would be if you're on one of the road courses that are in the DLC for the game. But the front weight, a lot of times I'll use the minimum front weight of 38.5 simply because I want to help the car to rotate. In general terms, the higher this number in front weight, the tighter, the more stable the car will be, but it can cause you to become too tight overall. But here at Arrowwood in the midgets, I find that I need that in the car because the car wants to rotate quite a bit, but we don't need it to rotate all that much at this track. We can easily run wide open, particularly if you're running the middle of the track toward the upper end of the track, which is where I generally get my best lap times. So I'm using more front weight here to tighten up the car, make the car more stable, which allows me to maintain more speed through the corners. But if you're finding that the car is just too tight, then one of your options is to lower this number around 39.0 or even down closer to the minimum of 38.5, and that will definitely loosen up the car and allow it to rotate more. Same thing with the crossweight. I'm using the maximum of 55.0. But if you find that the car just doesn't rotate enough or doesn't rotate quickly enough for you, then drop this number down to around 54, 53, and so on, and that will certainly free the car up. The front and rear ride heights, not a whole lot to be had here. I generally like to run the front just a little bit higher than the rear, but all you're really worried about here is not allowing the car to bottom out. So as long as you're not bottoming out, in general terms, you'll want to use the lowest numbers that you can get by with. Now we'll move on to the torsion bars. And the torsion bars, I run something a little bit different here. This is a great example of something that's different from what we saw in the 410s. You'll notice that overall, the front torsion bar diameters are at least 1 to 2 clicks more than what we see in the rear of the car. The reason for that is I wanted to tighten up the car a little bit. I wanted the front of the car to have a little bit more influence when driving the car, so I'm using some stiffer values here. 1.025, and then the maximum of 1.05 in the right front. Once again, a one-click difference between the left front and the right front, which generally works better for me not to have these the same, but as always, your mileage may vary in this particular situation. So you'll also notice that I'm using the maximum amount of preload in the right front. Going along with what we talked about with the front weight, I wanted to tighten up the car and stabilize the car. This is almost like, as far as the midget cars go, this is almost like a Daytona or a Talladega, where you're really trying to stabilize the car and scrub off the minimum amount of speed, and using extra preload, particularly in the right front, helps me to do that. However, if you find that the car is just too tight overall, then try reducing both the left front as well as the right front torsion bars, and that should help the car to rotate more, particularly the right front. Lowering this number will help the car to rotate. Also, reducing the right front preload will help to loosen the car, particularly on corner entry, and help it rotate better overall. Moving on now to the rear of the car. Once again, you'll see the left rear is at the minimum 0.95, and just one click higher on the right rear. Again, this is something I normally do. I have tried out using the same number for the left rear and the right rear, and it can work. It just introduces some instability in general for me that I like to stay away from. But by all means, test that out and see if that's something that works good for you. Not using any preload in the rear of the car. However, if you're looking for a way to tighten up the car, particularly from the center of the corner to the exit, then add some preload to the left rear, maybe 0.5 up to 1.0 or even higher, just depending on how much you want to tighten the car up overall. In the right rear, adding preload will loosen up the car, particularly from the center of the corner to the exit. But that is something that, in general, I don't like to use the right rear preload, because there are other ways, such as the stagger, that I can get more out of the right rear. So I generally stay away from the preload, but as always, test it out, see what works best for you. Tire pressures is not something I spend a whole lot of time with, simply because I don't see major changes in the handling by doing so. So test these out and see what works for you. Here, the right rear is really the only one that I played around with, and I dropped it all the way from, I believe, 9.0 down to the 4.0 that you see, just to tighten the car up a little bit. The right front is something you could work with. If you want to tighten up the car a little bit, then increase this number to maybe 14, 15, or even higher. See how that works out for you. If you want to loosen the car up a little bit, then drop this number down to around 11, 10, and so on. Moving on now to the miscellaneous settings. The left rear spacing as well as the right rear wheel spacing are both at max value. This is pretty traditional for me, as in general, I like the feel of this overall in the car. However, that doesn't mean it's something that you have to do. Lowering the left rear spacing, so using less spacing in the left rear, will loosen up the car and allow the car to rotate more. Lowering the right rear spacing will tighten the car up even more. So I use these in particular for overall rotation of the car. If the car is feeling good but just wants to over-rotate a little bit too much, then I can come in and adjust these to compensate for that. For example, if the car is just rotating too much, then I will come in and take a few clicks out of the right rear and see if that doesn't help to stabilize the car and take a little bit of rotation and tighten the car overall. Brake bias isn't something that I need on a normal basis here, since we're easily wide open. But if you are in traffic and you like to drag the brake a little bit to help control the car, then the higher the number you use for the brake bias, the more it's going to tighten up the car under braking. And lowering the brake bias will have the opposite effect. It will make the car want to rotate more, make it looser under braking. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees, which is the same as what you saw in all the 410 setups. Here in the midgets, I have tested out using numbers as low as 8, maybe even a little bit lower than that, and it works just fine. The lower the number you use for wheel lock, the slower it's going to make the steering. So basically, you're going to have to give it more steering input to get the same amount of reaction from the car, which is preferable for me, because I find at a track like this in the midgets where we're easily wide open, I want slower steering rather than the quicker steering, which can cause us to scrub off more speed. But if you're looking for quicker steering reactions overall, then increase this number to 14, 16, and so on, and you'll definitely get quicker reactions out of the wheel. Steering offset is a very low number, certainly low compared to what we saw in a lot of the 410 setups, and that's because I have reduced the stagger by quite a bit. So let's talk about stagger first. 13.0 is quite a bit lower than what we would traditionally see in the 410. A lot of times the 410 is up around the maximum of 20.0, which would lend itself to a much higher steering offset number. These two are very closely linked for me, as the higher number I use in the stagger, the higher number I'll use in the steering offset. Generally, the highest number I'll use in the offset will be somewhere around 1.5 to 1.75, just depending on the track. And that's assuming that I'm using a stagger that's at or very close to the maximum of 20.0. But here at this track, I just don't need all of the stagger. Now, I will tell you that I had really good lap times running lower than this, around 12 or even 11. I was still able to run fast lap times. Same thing, increasing this number up to or including the maximum of 20.0. But I simply found that 13 was a good middle ground, where it helped the car to rotate plenty well enough to get through the corner maintaining maximum speed, but not so much stagger that I was fighting the car basically turning right the entire time. So it's a little bit smoother here, but by all means, test out using lower numbers as well as higher numbers and see what works best for you overall. Rear end ratio 5.0 is a pretty good number for me. You can certainly get by trying to run a few more clicks here in the rear end ratio, or reducing this by a click or two and seeing what works best for you. It's all about ultimately what type of a lap time you're running at this particular track. For me, I'm somewhere in the mid 12.4 range, somewhere around 12.45, maybe even a little bit higher or lower, just depending on whether or not you have clear track and what groove you might be running. So plenty of speed available here and plenty of adjustability overall in the setup. And overall, that is the ultimate goal, giving you something that you can work with and dial in to your own personal preference. That's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more Tony Stewart Sprint Car Racing.